the textual critic Bart Ehrman wrote in a best-selling book on textual criticism these words: "Many of our cherished biblical stories and widely held beliefs concerning the divinity of Jesus, the Trinity, and the divine origins of the Bible itself stem from both intentional and accidental alterations by scribes." In fact, on the dust jacket it said that this book was going to explore this for, quote, the first time. So, to summarize, many people in our culture today believe that we can't really know what the original New Testament said, and this affects core beliefs like whether Jesus is God, the Trinity, and so on and so forth. And no one can really get back to the original manuscripts, and it's been translated through so many different languages that who's to say what the original Bible even stated? Well, Ehrman himself estimated that there are 400,000 variants in the New Testament. In fact, Ehrman said this on page 90 of Misquoting Jesus: "There are more variations among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament." So we are currently in the process today of reading copies of copies of copies of copies. How is it that we could have any sort of confidence in the original text? When we read these statements, these bombastic statements from Bart Ehrman that there are 400,000 variants, we need to remember that context matters. So that statement, there are 400,000 variants, that needs to be taken in context. Let me give you an example. Imagine I said to you that I saw your wife kissing a man in bed this week. Well, if I said that to you, you would surely go back to your wife and say, "Honey, I heard that you were kissing another man in bed. Say it ain't so." Well, what if your wife told you, "Well, I was kissing another man in bed. It was my elderly father. He was in the hospital on his deathbed, and I was kissing him on the forehead." Now, is that original statement false? That I saw your wife kissing another man in bed? No. Every word in that statement is true. What's the problem with that statement? It lacked context. And in fact, I think we would be naive to think that I said that to you with any other intention of trying to disrupt your marriage. Obviously, I was saying that to get you worked up and to cause division with you and your wife. I couldn't have genuinely have communicated so haphazardly as to say that without giving you the context. The same thing is true when we read from Ehrman that there are 400,000 variants in the New Testament. In fact, what we see when we study the subject of textual criticism, or lower criticism is what it's called, that this turns out to be one of the better evidences for the reliability of the New Testament documents. Let me give you one line of evidence. Number one, the New Testament documents have far more manuscripts and far closer manuscripts to the originals than any other document in antiquity. So if you look at any other document from ancient times or antiquity, the New Testament blows them away on the order of sometimes 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1 in some cases. So just to look at this more closely, Ed Kamajewski, who is a Christian textual critic writing with James Sawyer and Daniel Wallace, who is the leading Christian textual critic in the United States. He's the top Christian in this field. They write this in their book, Reinventing Jesus. Quote, "If the average-sized manuscript were 2½ inches thick, all the copies of the works of an average Greek author would stack about 4 feet high. The copies of the New Testament, by contrast, would stack up to over a mile high. This is indeed an embarrassment of riches." So just to look at that together. The average Greek writer, how many manuscripts do we have? Well, about 4 feet. When we compare this with the New Testament, we're not saying that the New Testament is like a 20-foot, 2-story house. No. That's not even close. Nor are we saying that the New Testament is like a stack of manuscripts that is like the Statue of Liberty. That wouldn't be the right comparison. That doesn't actually compare with what we have in our hands with the New Testament. Nor could we say that the New Testament documents or manuscripts would be like, say, the Empire State Building, 1,250 feet high, compared to a 4-foot average Greek writer with their manuscripts. And that is to scale, by the way, in case you're wondering. No, what we see when we look at the New Testament is that we have 4.5 Empire State Buildings, a mile, 5,280 feet over here compared to the average Greek writer at the time. So I know that when Kamajutsky and Sawyer and Dan Wallace wrote this, they took a lot of flack for that final statement that this is indeed an embarrassment of riches. Many people said that Daniel Wallace was effectively just trying to be an apologist and defend his Christian faith. And so he was saying it's an embarrassment of riches. And yet, at the same time, some of Wallace's colleagues in a separate book said essentially the same thing. They said this, quote, "The textual critic of the New Testament is embarrassed by the wealth of material, an embarrassment of riches, or embarrassed by the wealth of material." Who was it that said that? Well, two textual critics, Bruce Metzger and his protege, Bart Ehrman, in their graduate textbook on textual criticism. So they said essentially the same thing. What's interesting is that this graduate textbook came out right around the same time that Bart Ehrman published misquoting Jesus. Let's look at this from another perspective. When we compare the manuscripts of the ancient world, of antiquity, with the New Testament, Tacitus, Herodotus, Thucydides, Sophocles, Plato, etc., etc. When we look at the ancient work and when it was dated, and we compare that to the earliest manuscript in our possession. So, Tacitus was written in AD 110, but our earliest manuscript is dated somewhere between 850 and 1050. Or Herodotus from the 400s. No, our earliest manuscript is 150 to 50 BC. Thucydides, same thing, 400s BC, 3rd century BC. All the way down to Homer's Iliad. The earliest manuscript dates to 415 BC, even though this was written in around 800 BC. We see that when we look at the New Testament manuscripts, the comparison is actually incomparable. Our earliest manuscript of the New Testament is the P52 document, the so-called John Rylands fragment. This is a little fragment about the size of a credit card that has John 18:31 to 33, and then on the flip side, it has John 18:37 to 38. So it's a little tiny fragment, but it shows that it was written on the front and the back. And this dates, according to paleographers, to 125 AD. Many scholars believe that this is the first copy of the original autograph, the original Gospel of John. Auto meaning self and graphe meaning writing. So the original Gospel of John was written in about 80, 85, or 90, most likely. This is probably the first copy of the Gospel of John. So the gap is incredibly small by comparison. So the gap of time for Tacitus is 750 years. Herodotus, 250 years. Thucydides, Sophocles, 150 years. And so on it goes. The gap for the New Testament, the earliest manuscript, 30 years. 30 years of time. What about the total manuscripts? Tacitus, there's a total of 36 manuscripts for his historical annals. What about Herodotus? 106 manuscripts. Thucydides, the Prince of History, 188, all the way down the line until you get to Homer's Iliad that has a total of 1,900 manuscripts. How does this compare to the New Testament? How many manuscripts does the New Testament have? 5,856 manuscripts. Now these are just the Greek manuscripts. If you include the Latin and Slavic and other languages into which the New Testament was translated, you have a total of 25,000 manuscripts of the New Testament before the modern era. So what we have here, the printing press, these were all handwritten copies. Once you get to the printing press, you're in a different league. But just to compare apples to apples, what we have here is handwritten copies that are just dwarfing anything that we see in antiquity. Well, what are some of the manuscripts that we have? Let's start in the 4th century with the so-called neutral text. Codex Vaticanus is nearly the complete Bible. The Greek Septuagint of the Old Testament and nearly the entire New Testament. Then we have Codex Sinaiticus, which is from the 4th century as well. It's about AD 325 to 350. It has a full New Testament and half of the Old Testament. So this is called the neutral text. And we compare these with each other and then other manuscripts against this neutral text. In addition to this, we have the Bodmer Papyri. Papyri is plural for papyrus, the P66 papyrus. This has the Gospel according to John, part of Luke, 1st and 2nd Peter, and Jude. Then the Chester Beatty Papyri. This has much of the Gospels, Acts, most of Paul's letters, Hebrews, and Revelation. Then finally, the John Rylands fragment, which dates as early as AD 125. What about when we look at actual manuscripts for the Gospels? Well, we have Matthew, Mark, and Luke that date from 125 to 175 to 200 AD. So many different manuscripts of the 4 Gospels, not just John in 125. That's our earliest. But we have manuscripts that come all the way through the 2nd century, and then complete Bibles by the 4th century. And let me just say this. These early manuscripts, it's not that they change with the later manuscripts, it's that they're strikingly similar to one another. And when textual critics put these together, they see that what they have is actually something that's fitting together to show what the original would have said. So too, we have about 356 manuscripts of the Gospels, 112 manuscripts of the Book of Acts and the so-called Catholic epistles. This doesn't mean Roman Catholic. These are the universal. Catholic just means universal. So James, 1st and 2nd Peter, Jude, the Johannine letters, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and so forth. We have 158 manuscripts of Paul, 33 of Revelation, and what are called lectionaries. Maybe you grew up in a traditional church where they would read from certain chunks of the Bible. That's from a lectionary. So we have lectionaries that date, this is before the end of the 1st millennium, and we have a plethora of manuscripts of the Gospels, Paul's letters, the Book of Acts, and when we lay these on top of each other, so to speak, textual critics are able to discern and see which manuscript has the original reading through the canons of textual criticism. So this is all before the so-called Byzantine text that comes far later. That's the foundation for the King James Bible. These are the earliest manuscripts that we have. They go back very early, and we have a plethora of manuscripts. Here's another way of looking at it. Of course, in the 2nd century and the 3rd century and 4th century, we don't have as many manuscripts. Why? Because they were written on papyrus, kind of a reedy material that very easily fell apart. But we do have still a plethora of manuscripts, and the further we go, we have more and more manuscripts. So, our first line of evidence is that the New Testament has more manuscripts, and these manuscripts go back closer to the originals than any other document in antiquity. Number 2, the New Testament documents have far more citations. What do we mean by this? Well, just imagine that we could somehow just light a match and burn up every New Testament manuscript that there is. And we could burn up every translation of the Bible. And we could get some kind of a computer virus that would go through and wipe out every New Testament translation and everything else on the internet. And we could burn up every Bible in existence. Let's just say we could get rid of every Bible that has ever existed. We could still virtually reconstruct the entire New Testament simply based on the early Christians' citations of the New Testament. These church fathers is what they're called. They cited the New Testament so frequently, and they lacked brevity, that's for sure, when they would write their commentaries and letters. They would cite the New Testament over and over and over again to the point where we could virtually reconstruct the New Testament. One textual critic has this to say: so extensive are these citations from the church fathers that if all other sources for our knowledge of the text of the New Testament were destroyed, these alone would be sufficient for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament. Which textual critic said that? Bart Ehrman, in his graduate textbook on textual criticism, page 126, which came out in 2005, the same year as misquoting Jesus. Well, what about number 3? A third line of evidence would be that the New Testament documents have a wide geographical distribution. This means that not any church or any person or any individual could have control over the New Testament documents. This whole concept that Constantine could control the New Testament, or one particular bishop of a church could control the spread of the New Testament, or that the emperors could, no one could, because these manuscripts spread far and wide across the Roman Empire. Just to give you an idea, what we have is the Alexandrian text on the continent of Africa, and we have the Western text, so-called, up in Rome, and then we have what's called the Caesarean text, which is up in Turkey and Syria and Israel. Many textual critics believe that the Caesarean text is really just a hybrid of the Western text and the Alexandrian text. What this means is, as we study this, these are all across the ancient world: Egypt, Italy, Turkey, Greece. They're not in any one location. There's not a cache of manuscripts. They're all over the place. They have multiple independent manuscript families. They sound different. They have different variants in the same places. No one would have been able to control these manuscript families for the first several centuries. And we have the manuscripts before the time of Constantine or whoever else we think was in control of the manuscript families. And so what that means is these manuscript families were so broad that no one could have controlled them. You know, compared this to Islam, where Uthman in the 7th century was trying to get rid of the differences in the Quran, the textual differences. So he just took the Quran texts that he thought were the originals, and he incinerated the rest. Well, that's one way to get rid of textual differences. In the New Testament, what we have is a bunch of textual families that were copied and recopied, and this makes the original come to light clearer. Well, in conclusion, we could say that the New Testament is extremely well preserved. The United Bible Society, what is called the UBS 4, contains variants affecting over 1,500 words out of a total of 138,020 words. So, in other words, out of the 138,000 words in the New Testament, only 1% are in dispute. Only 1%, or to put that a different way, 99% of the New Testament is considered original. That we know that goes back to the original. There is a 1% of the New Testament that is in dispute. Now, this doesn't mean that we have a lost New Testament, that, we only have 99% of the New Testament. No, as one scholar put it, we have 102% of the original New Testament. What does he mean by that? He means that we have more manuscripts than the original. And it is the job of textual critics to show out of that pot of 102% of these words which were not in the originals. Furthermore, of these 1,500 words, no core doctrines are affected. The parts that are in dispute, no core Christian doctrine hangs on that 1%. It simply doesn't work that way. That's not what we have in our Bibles. In fact, essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. I bet you're wondering which textual critics had this to say. Bart Ehrman, in his book, Misquoting Jesus, on page 252. This whole idea that the deity of Christ and the Trinity and our famed core doctrines that he says in the beginning of the book on the dust jacket are affected, and we're bringing this to the world for the first time. All of this is taken back by Bart Ehrman on page 252. No core doctrine hangs on this 1%. Well, fortunately, I got to page 252 in the book to be able to see that, because otherwise I may have had a much different impression.